That'd be a good idea.
Okay. I move to reappoint Kurt Melcher as Director of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for a term of 4 years, commencing at the end of his prior term. I also move to authorize the Commission Chair to handle the employment offer and associated negotiations with Kurt Melcher, and to work with Roxy Burns, ODFW Human Resources Administrator, as needed.
I can do
Yeah, I second it. If there's no discussion, I would second that motion.
that. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any comments, commissioners? All right, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, passes unanimously by the 5 commissioners present.
Mr. Chair, if I might, I guess I would just like to thank you all for your support, and this would be the third time now that someone has made a motion to appoint me as the director, well, actually the interim director initially, and then permanent director 4 years ago, and I'm incredibly humbled and honored to serve in this role. It's ODFW is a great place to work, and we have an incredibly talented staff that I look forward to working with every day, and appreciate the opportunity to do that for another 4 years. Thank you.
Well, we're pleased to appoint you. It was obviously unanimous, and we had a great evaluation session, and so we'll continue on a path of making better stewardship decisions for the agency. All right. Bob.
Okay, as everybody here knows, there is a Oregon subcommittee made up of Bruce, Holly, and I, and a Washington Commission subcommittee who are to work on concurrence of the Columbia River fisheries. And we had a meeting on Wednesday. I think Holly sent out her comments. The reason that I wanted to have a discussion at this meeting is that I felt we needed to have some sideboards as to what the subcommittee would be considering as far as what, in terms of what Washington would agree to. Currently, I think Washington's policy is that they don't allow gill nets. And Bruce can correct me if I'm wrong. And we've kind of talked about a number of ways to get concurrence. One of them would be for Washington to back off to their regulations last year, 2018. One would be for Washington, well, and the other one would be that we agree to do the current Oregon regulations. A third one would be to go back in time to where we were for the freeze of the transition. And then there's a no economic loss 1 and no economic loss 2, which are other combinations as far as allocations and gear, that sort of thing. And I was concerned that when we're negotiating with Washington, we need to know what this commission is thinking about, what we would be, as a commission, would be willing to do.
Commissioner Buckmaster.
And I agree with Commissioner Weber. I think it's important to note for the full commission that of the models we have looked at, we are currently considering. First off, I'll say that we elected a chair, being a Washington Commissioner, Don McIsaac, who previously was executive director of PFMC. So he has some experience herding cats, and then the other two commissioners are Bob Kehoe from the Puget Sound area and Dave Grable from Eastern Washington. Of the various, and I'm glad we still have our staff person here, Tucker. Correct me if I make a mistake. Of the options that we have put on the table to consider, all of them have increased, contain increased angler trips for sports fishing. Washington did not put on the table for discussion their current policy, which is an outright ban of gill nets on the Columbia. At least their subcommittee did not do that. Their status quo Washington really was what we arrived at last year with fishings in zone 4 and fishing in zones 4 and 5 and no summer, no spring. It was Commissioner Atkinson that challenged staff to come up with the no economic loss, because that was an issue she wanted to see happen, that she felt that our previous commissions had voted for, and we had two options on that. And the transition actually goes back to the last time where we were in full concurrence, and that encompasses losses to the commercial fleet over the next 3 years, I believe, and getting to a positive economic impact on the 4th and 5th years of a 5-year plan. Am I characterizing that correctly, Tucker? Okay. So I think that's what is currently on the table that we've been discussing. And so when you look at the potential for sideboards, if there's anything you want to narrow down on or expand upon, I guess that's what we need to hear.
I have a comment. So, from my understanding, one of the sticking points have been, so when Governor Kitzhaber assigned us to work this out, and we had the list of goals or objectives, and Washington had theirs. Washington's plan does not as clearly denote economic viability for the commercial fleet. And so that we're working under some different criteria. And so, Commissioner Weber, when I hear you talk about or ask what can we do, and you are referencing Washington eliminating gill nets, is it something that we can do to get closer to Washington as far as fewer gill nets or potentially no gill nets on the Columbia? I mean, is that what you were inferring when you were saying let's get closer? Because we have some different criteria in terms of our obligation to the commercial fleet that seems more stringent than what Washington has.
No, I wasn't suggesting that we would go to Washington's current policy. I was just saying that their current policy is no gill nets.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to get. We need to figure out concurrence between Washington and Oregon, realizing what their policy says versus where we need to get to.
So they're being asked the same question in relation to our policy of how can they get more concurrence with Oregon? Or is it Oregon the state that's being asked to
No,
make the
it
changes?
was, I suggested that the subcommittee needed to go to their respective commissions and get some guidance on sideboards for where we're negotiating. And that we would do it today. And I think they were either doing it today or tomorrow because they're meeting today and tomorrow to get sideboards. That's, you know, and what I would say is that, when I look at, at this, I guess my preference would be kind of trying to bring Washington closer to our current policy, to get them to make that step. I would not be in favor of changing our policy and then trying to get them to go that greater distance.
Okay.
And I think Bruce and Holly would disagree with me on that.
Well, I'm not sure when we look at the actual numbers if there's that much of a disagreement, because where we currently are has been very close to the transition. We pretty much said, wait, we're not going any, we look at the numbers, we're not going any further. Before we go any further on this, we are also constrained by the language of statute, the Senate Bill 830, and I would guess that our once and future director probably has that language.
We do, we just reviewed it.
Yeah.
It's silent on gill nets, and it says we must enhance both commercial and sport fishery.
So that's, and if it doesn't, we have to take action. So I think what Holly and I were looking at and looking back at that transition basically says, no gill nets in the spring, which was a big issue for Washington. But we have always considered, our policy has always considered tangle nets as alternative gear and selective gear. So our current policy says spring, and I don't know what the number ends up being, whether it's 70-30, 80-20, but whatever that is, and tangle nets, 20% of those impacts end up getting used in the select areas. So additional potential after the run update to use tangle nets in the spring. Talking to we have had numbers in the summer fishery, but frankly, if we can get Washington to move towards a healthy fall fishery, which is gill nets in zones 4 and 5 for Chinook, tangle nets and or 6-inch gill nets in the lower river for coho. This year we should see a lot of coho. Then I think there might be an opportunity for us to actually move away from gill nets in the summer. It's a cost, but talking to the commercial fleet, I think they might be willing to do that. So that would basically leave gill nets in the main stem for one season, for fall.
That would be, our current policy is no summer gill nets.
Yeah, but we're talking about just taking it off the board. We actually had, I think we reserved, 20% allocation in our policy, and said if they didn't use it, they would move upriver. So basically, I think what we're looking at is what what would be required in summer to prosecute the select area fishery. Now, we've thrown some other stuff out on the table for discussion. For instance, when it gets right, the amount of smolts produced, provided by the state of Washington for select areas right now, I believe, is 250,000. Correct?
That's the goal.
That's the goal. Okay, so and they haven't found any select area locations, anything up there that they're going to use. We asked them to consider the potential for using maybe Willapa Bay, using spring salmon could work there because they wouldn't go up. There's no expectation that they would take naturally. If they use fall Chinook in Willapa Bay, they would have to put weirs on those two or three, the Nema and I think the nacelle, maybe another one, that where they have some wild stock. So they'd have to put a weir in. But if they were to do that to give us the same concurrence or the same consideration of concurrent waters that we give to Washington fishers in our state waters of Young's Bay. So those things are on the table for them to discuss, but they're not going to make any difference for this 2019 concurrency issue.
Okay, so what I'm trying to figure out is, are you saying that basically we're trying to work between Oregon's current policy and Washington's 2018 policy to get concurrence?
Since they have put nothing on the table other than their 2018, I would say definitely yes to that. And for ours, it's very close to what we proposed for how close is it, Tucker, for what we had proposed for 2018?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
So the difference between what we finally agreed to, what they agreed to do, Washington agreed to do in 2018, and what we had tried to do in 2018. Isn't what we originally asked for almost identical to, if not identical to, the transition?
It was essentially 2018 operated very similarly to the current Oregon policy. There wasn't a tangle net fishery in the spring post-update, but that was because the update, well, one of the reasons was because the update was the second latest ever on record, and there were a lot of sockeye in the river, which sort of precluded the tangle net as a gear. But yeah, otherwise, it's sort of operated under the Oregon policies in 18.
And didn't our plan still have coho, tangle net, and 6-inch, but we just didn't have any fish to catch?
Our plan only has coho tangle net, does not allow a 6-inch gear in the fall. But you're correct, there were coho, although there weren't a ton, but it was a Chinook impact limited year, so that there wasn't a Chinook impact available for the coho fisheries in the fall.
As I understand it, reading, well, I guess that their 18 policy, and I don't know, did they, in Washington's policy for 2018, did they allow gill nets in 4 or 5?
In 18, yes.
And what they presented to us on Wednesday as their status quo also had them.
Well, I'm thinking that it was. And I have high hopes that we could
Yeah, thank you.
get concurrence with Washington if we're talking about concurrence between our current regs and what they did last year. In fact, I think, they may come to where we are. I just didn't know, I guess the concerns I was having is whether we're talking about a world of possibilities or those narrow considerations.
Let me make a comment on that. I think this, and I don't want to speak for Commissioner Atkinson, but we did speak about this, that our general concern was that if we stop, that our first concern was that we might seek concurrence for a 2019 set of rules or a set of management guidelines on the river, get that concurrence and then revert at the end of 2019 to where they were, which is an outright ban, which shows losses of 25 to 35% going forward to a commercial fleet, which I don't think we can do legally. So we didn't want that to happen. And the question was, if we just do 2019, which is the way we split it up, let's find concurrency and then we'll look for long-term solutions. 2020 is, can we do something in 2019 which becomes the status quo, which at the very least gives us some opportunity to move closer to our by statute mandated goals of the economic enhancement or viability or whatever that is for both groups. So the only thing I think we're talking about different or pushing over last year really would be the potential for getting Washington to agree that post-update tangle nets are a tool in the spring. It is select gear, and that there might be the possibility of using 6-inch coho in the fall in the lower river. And then there's some, and I don't know, you did a great job of talking on that, Tucker, just like that 75-35, and you explained that 70, no worse, no less than no more than 70, no less than 30. But anyway, looking at the numbers there and balancing those out. So.
Is there a question?
Well, just, if you've heard anything that's wrong.
No, I think that accurately characterizes what we presented was that yesterday? Wednesday. What day is today? Yeah, I think that's correct. And again, I think much of what's there is right, from both Commissioner Weber and Buckmaster, that getting concurrency in 2019 is going to be tremendously important for orderly fisheries. And I guess if that's all the commissions want to do, then staff will work through that and we'll be here again next year. But, I know this doesn't matter, but from a staff perspective, certainly we would like something a little more durable.
Now, and the other thing is, and part of this is that there's a North of Falcon meeting in March where they're divvying up the fish from Falcon North, and I don't understand it, Tucker would have to explain it, but they would like to know what we're doing before that.
For summer and fall.
Summer and fall, is that?
Yeah, the North of Falcon planning process deals with basically all summer and fall fisheries for the Northwest. So ocean harvests and then in-river tribal and non-tribal harvests also. And so knowing how you're going to, I guess, apportion impacts within the river affects kind of how many impacts we will need to have in river from the ocean, and so it will help with the ocean planning of those fisheries as well.
So I understand that for North of Falcon, we need summer information, fall information, that information being allocation and gear type. We have less pressure really on summer because the preseason estimates on summer would indicate that there's probably not going to be a fishery
Probably not downstream of Bonneville.
downstream
for
of
sure.
Bonneville.
Or downstream of Priest, probably.
So the fall fishery, the difference between no less than 70 for sport, no less than 30 for commercial, no more than 70 for sport, could get us to, and large match zones 4 and 5, and then coho, which I think Holly and I will advocate for the 6-inch gill net and/or the tangle net, depending upon what's in the river and how management wants to structure it. That's really all we need. If we can get to that point, then north of Falcon will have plenty. Correct? That's enough.
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
So you need the allocation and the gear type. Okay.
Is Young's Bay still being discussed at all?
Yes.
In
The-
discussions?
I think I would say yes, that it's on our agenda, the Youngs Bay exclusion zone and barbless hooks.
Now, I'm going to say something about our chair for this working group, Don McIsaac, very knowledgeable commissioner, is hot on making barbless hooks in the Columbia voluntary. And he is pushing, he's saying there's no evidence, blah, blah, blah. He goes on and he makes his case. I don't mean to say blah, blah. He makes his case. Whether or not that is appropriate in our discussion, this bi-state plan, I would remind our commission that the commercial fleet never advocated one way or the other about barbless hooks. It was their policy from the very beginning in writing that whatever is agreed upon by staff of both states and the recreational advisory group, that's up to them. On a personal basis, I have a problem with it. But if it becomes necessary to take it out, what I told Chair McIsaac is that it has to be clear that this is an issue which will not go away. That we need to have a full, both commissions, and maybe in the framework of a bi-state working group, listen to all of the input from various groups. I think maybe Mr. Moskowitz might even have an opinion on barbed hooks, and they don't have the opportunity as we're working on this bi-state plan to weigh in on it. So if we need to set it aside,
What happened to the Washington that
yeah, they actually pushed it.
pushed it when we did this before?
Yeah, that Washington doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
No, that's gone.
If I may also, for the members of the commission, I just want you to know that those two issues, the Youngs Bay control zone and the barbed hooked versus barbless hooks, those have been largely Washington-driven issues in this policy review committee. Oregon staff had heard their commission pretty loudly and clearly and did not bring this up again. I
First
just-
off,
I
they're
want
not
you to
an issue of
understand that.
non-concurrency.
Well, the only thing I'm thinking, my thinking is that we are wanting Washington to go along with gill nets in 4-5,
Like they did last year.
like they did last year. And if we can throw them a bone, then so that's where we'd have to
But
deal with it.
and my feeling is they're already at gill nets in 4 and 5 because the numbers, their staff recommendation, their staff analysis of how well the plans work is absolutely consistent with our 250, 300-page staff report on how well it's worked. It has not economically. In order to move forward with anything, with any kind of trajectory towards no economic harm, we've got to have that fishery. And I think they're already there. So if we're going to throw other things in to entice them, I think it needs to be for the lower river coho fishery, and make sure that we can do what we've decided all along, is to have the option to use tangle nets post-update in the spring, and be willing to give up summer if necessary.
Well, I don't like barb hooks, as you all know, but I would be willing to have those seasons to give that up on that Columbia's.
Yeah, and I think I voted for barbless hook,
Yeah,
because
I did too.
it is so logical to me that if the fish are getting off on their own, it's obviously releasing them is easier. And you would think mortality would be down, although we don't get any advantage for that.
So how many studies have we done? Kurt, I think you would be answer this, studies on barbed and barbless hooks.
Well, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Biddle, there's been numerous studies done over the years on the barbed versus barbless hook issue. I think it's pretty well demonstrated that it's not the barb that kills the fish, it's the hook wound location. So if they're hooked in the eye, the gills, the gut, there's a high probability that those fish will die. If they're hooked anywhere else, there's a low probability that they'll die. Barbed hooks, or I should say barbless hooks, may reduce to some degree handling time. There's also been work done though that I'll just take you back to my early part of my career when we were working on ocean hooking mortality rates, and there was no correlation between handling time and the ultimate outcome. In other words, it wasn't the handling time that was killing fish, it was the hook wound location. So in the department, we've been pretty consistent on that over the last 30 years. I think, Mr. Chair, if I might also, when we met with the Washington Commission in joint session back in November, just north of here, there was, I think, pretty much consensus amongst all the commissioners that we wanted to move forward in an effort to get concurrent regulations and concurrent policies in place. And so each of the commissions agreed that they would appoint a subgroup to work on that issue. Of course, you did appoint a subgroup, as did their chair. The subgroup's meeting to try and do that, to try and achieve concurrency. I think it's been clear to us, at least to the Oregon staff from the beginning, that concurrency from the perspective of Oregon meant that we weren't deviating from the Oregon policy that's in place now, at least with respect to the commercial allocation, that we weren't going to further reduce the commercial opportunity in order to reach concurrency. I think Washington, so I think they understand that they're coming our direction. But the question that Commissioner Weber is raising, and it's a great question, is that over the course of these discussions, there's other things that have come up, like this idea that Commissioner Buckmaster was talking about essentially trading summer Chinook, saying trading away the commercial summer Chinook opportunity in exchange for some increment more of spring Chinook opportunity. And that's really kind of the question at hand. I don't know, and obviously we're not in a rule-making position here. We're not making any decisions. We're trying to gauge the commission's interest on all these things as best we can. And without that, the work group will continue to meet and will continue to try and achieve a concurrent approach that we will then bring back to each commission to independently act on.
Does Washington have an endorsement fee like we do?
Funny you should mention that.
They do, it's not like we do, though.
No, not a penny of it goes for this plan.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, it seems to me like they just want to ban gill nets so they can just walk away from the whole situation. I'm just throwing it out
I
there.
can't tell you what they think.
So this gentleman that wants, that's getting in the weeds about barbed or barbless hook, he wants that to be volunteer?
Voluntary.
Who's volunteer now?
No?
Well, it is, Bob. If you go to the store, I'm gonna buy barbless hooks or not barbless hooks if I want to, you know, or barbed hooks and not barbless if I want to volunteer to do that. So you're getting in the weeds over a really small thing. So, I mean, if that wants to be a volunteer and that has to be part of the deal, throw it in.
Well, I would, you know, that's, I'm just, but
But it always seems like one of those deals you're making where, okay, now we're all on the same page, but, you know, up pops this.
Well, I think I'm in agreement, I think on this issue, I tend to be in agreement with our chair. In order to get through a negotiation, acceptable negotiation with Washington on the bi-state plan, if they want to make this barbless, go back to barbless being voluntary, that's a huge change for them. For us, it's only changed in the last year. And, but I would make note that both commissions need to be prepared to discuss this as a full topic and involving all the stakeholders. I mean, I've heard for years, I've listened to Steve Williams talk, and I believe hook placement is absolutely critical. But I sit back and go, well, why do we have barbless hook regulations anywhere? If there's no problem. But, so there is a discussion to be had, and I want to make sure Moskowitz has a chance to weigh in.
Well, let's at least have one sideboard for Bob. We need concurrence.
oh, yeah, well, that's.
I mean, we're gonna get a letter from the governor again.
That's it's a given that we are going to get as close to concurrence as we can.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
It's just,
Manage concurrently.
pardon?
We will manage concurrently like
Right,
we've
and I'm
always
just
done.
trying to get sideboards of how far afield from Oregon's current rules we want to get, or if we're trying to just get from our rules and Washington rules to be concurrent.
My personal view is if there's something that we exchange, it isn't either unethical in terms of our charge that we can live with. I mean,
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we've never described concurrency as being exactly the same. It's being as close as what we all can agree with and work with and move forward with. It's not exact.
That's right.
Well, I think concurrency is the same, and we're required by statute to do it. Although if we don't quite get concurrency, the directors can work it out to where the management is not chaotic. That's my belief of where we have been.
There's a long history of doing that. I mean, we've done spring Chinook where there's a 5% gets set off to the side. We've done, so, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to meet our statutory, to strive to meet our statutory requirement, which is the economic enhancement of both user groups. And just saying, okay, let's do 2019 and have that become the status quo that locks us in potentially to a management scheme that does not meet our statutory guidelines. is, to me, it's unacceptable.
Yeah, well, we have to follow the statute, and we should follow the statute. I think the committee just has to do the best we can to bring this to concurrence. And if we have to trade something, you know, I haven't used a barb in 20 years. And I'm gonna be fishing for sea run browns in Patagonia soon.
You had to get that in.
And I'm not gonna be using a barbed hook. And I can guarantee I'll land it.
Hey, I have one more question, please. That endorsement, I don't think I've ever seen it, the Columbia River endorsement, the breakdown of how that money's spent.
That came up as well, and our director of our fisheries chief, committed to give a 2-page, accounting of how those monies are spent in Oregon and provide it to the subcommittee. And I will ask Tucker to make sure that it goes to the full commission.
Yeah, we can make sure that it will go to the full commission, and it will also then be posted
And
on
when
the
we asked
website.
Washington for theirs, they basically told us to go pound sand. They weren't gonna tell us how they used it. Didn't have anything to do with what we were talking about. They did it very nicely, and they were very polite when they did it, but that was kind of where it ended up.
Well, I don't know if we helped you, Bob,
No, I think that helps.
you and Bruce.
We actually do what Holly says anyway.
You could do worse.
Yeah, we can't get in trouble that way.
Okay. Are we ready to adjourn?
Jim wants to talk some more.
No.